Every one of us uses bar soap, hopefully every day. That's why it's a $1.6 billion industry in the United States. When one thinks of soap, one thinks of one company, Procter & Gamble. When one thinks of Procter & Gamble, one thinks of one soap, Ivory. One might think soap is a mundane business where there's little opportunity for strategy. After all, soap is soap. In fact, soap provides a fascinating example of competitive positioning. Ivory was introduced many years ago, actually in 1879. At the time, there were over 300 companies in the soap industry. Most of these companies competed with a strategy producing very crude soaps. The other competitors in the soap industry at the time were producers of very expensive luxury soaps. Now, Ivory decided to enter the market with a very different strategy for the time. The basic Ivory strategy was to introduce a pure, mild bar of soap without the harsh ingredients and alkalis that were characteristic of the other soaps of the time. The Ivory bar also floated. Interestingly enough, though, the floating was an accident. Ivory made some bars up by accident in the manufacturing process, and it turned out that they floated. Consumers were so interested in that feature that Procter & Gamble quickly decided that it was a good idea. In addition to the product itself, however, Ivory created some very important symbols of its strategy. The first was whiteness. At the time, most soaps were brown in color, various shades of brown. Ivory instead became the white soap. Ivory was the first heavily advertised soap, in fact, one of the first heavily advertised brands in the United States of any kind. In addition to the advertising, though, was the advertising message. Harley Procter had a very interesting idea. He had the problem of communicating purity, and there was no well-established standards for purity in the consumer's mind. So Harley Procter designed his own measure of purity, which led to the famous slogan, 99 and 44 100% pure. This became the slogan that personified the Ivory brand. Once Harley Procter had created this measure of purity, he aggressively used comparison ads with other soaps. In fact, tables appeared in magazines which compared Ivory to other brands. Later on, he started very early to use endorsements. He had chemists and physicians certified to the purity of the Ivory brand. The final early innovation in Procter & Gamble advertising was the use of the image of the baby. The baby became one of the early symbols of Ivory. Mild, if it's mild enough for the baby, it's got to be mild enough for you. The results of the Ivory strategy were astounding. Ivory became the differentiated soap in the United States. It commanded a premium price, and it also commanded a leading share of the soap market, dominating all other competitors. Ivory pursued its differentiation strategy up through the 1940s and 1950s. But important changes in the industry in the 1950s and 1960s were threatening and challenging the traditional Ivory strategy. The first was Dial. Dial was the first of the so-called deodorant bars. In addition to basic cleaning, it offered a deodorizing feature as well. A number of other deodorant bars followed. The second major development was Dove. Dove was specially formulated to take good care of the skin, so-called beauty bar. Dove was introduced in 1956, and again, others followed. Now, the introduction of Dial and Dove fundamentally threatened the positioning of Ivory as the differentiated soap. These new products had features that Ivory didn't have. Now, Procter & Gamble had a choice at this stage. It could have added these new features, one or both of them, to Ivory, but it chose not to. Instead, Procter & Gamble decided to strategically reposition Ivory. Now, the basic Ivory bar remained the same. It's white, it floats, it's 99, 44, 100% pure. But Ivory moved from being the differentiated soap to being the good basic soap that represents a good value. It moved from being the differentiator to being the cost leader in the soap industry. And in the process, Ivory was able to maintain its leading market position. Now, what is the new Ivory strategy? Well, let's start with the bar. The Ivory strategy is to have a simple, basic, no-frills soap. No unnecessary ingredients, no scents, no perfumes. Now, how about the packaging? Well, as you can see here, the Ivory package aims for simplicity. There's no expensive papers, no shiny paper, no garish colors. Look at this bar here. That's pretty garish. Ivory goes for simplicity, for simple, for basic. Now, in terms of packaging, Ivory pioneered a practice in the industry called bundling. Here's an example of a bundle of soap. There are 6 bars here sold together. And what this did was go from having a bunch of bars sitting in the bin in a disarray to a neat kind of package. And the idea here was that Ivory could be used by the whole family, so you should buy it in quantity.
The user for Ivory is a remarkably diverse consumer base. There is no meaningful demographic skew on Ivory, as you might expect with a brand of that kind of market share and broad usage. It is well developed amongst females, adult males, children and infants, for many, many purposes, ranging from face to hands, bath, shower. And that is really one of the things that makes Ivory unique. When we sit down with consumers, we'll give them an array of 30 or 40 available brands and ask them to cluster them as they see the brands clustering. Ivory always sits out by itself. And that's one of the things that distinguishes it, is it's really all-purpose versatility.
Ivory's pricing changed to reflect its fundamental shift in strategy. Instead of pricing at a premium, Ivory set its prices lower than its major differentiated competitors. The final aspect of Ivory's strategy was advertising, and Ivory advertising again stressed this theme of simplicity, a basic soap for the whole family, nothing more, nothing less.
I know I'm new, but this price can't be right.
What's wrong?
Ivory costs less than just about all the other soaps in the store?
It usually does.
I can't believe a great soap like Ivory costs less. I mean, that rich lather and natural kind of clean.
In fact, 4 bars of Ivory usually cost less than 3 of most others.
I thought they'd charge more for a great soap like Ivory.
They probably should.
You'd expect to pay more for Ivory, but isn't it nice you don't have to?
We've seen the new Ivory strategy. Now, what makes Ivory low cost? Well, let's look at a number of the most important elements. Let's start with the air bubbles. The air bubbles in the Ivory product inherently reduce the amount of material required to manufacture an Ivory bar. The lack of expensive additives like deodorants or beauty features also make the bar inherently less expensive. The simple packaging with no shiny materials or expensive papers are inherently cheaper to produce. And Ivory, because of its long, consistent brand image, controls advertising cost. Now, the brand image, in addition to the fact that Ivory is such a good value because of its lower price, means that Ivory is a very effective traffic builder for the retail store. And that means that Ivory has to spend less on trade promotion than many of its competitors do. When you add to this that Procter & Gamble gets other cost advantages through scale and things like purchasing and distribution, all this means that Ivory has a substantial cost advantage over many of its competitors. Ivory charges a lower price, but its cost, because of this strategy, is even lower. And the result is a very profitable business. The intriguing thing about the Ivory strategy is it makes many of these cost savings into a virtue. Now, if we step back from the soap competition that I've described, I think we can get some insight into how various strategies play against each other in the industry. Now, we can see from the diagram that Ivory competes with just about everybody. It competes with Dial and Dove for the more quality-sensitive consumers. It competes with the no-name brands for the very price-sensitive consumer. It doesn't compete, however, very much with the exotic brands because they're really targeting a totally different part of the market. But despite Ivory's success, The soap business isn't standing still. It's always changing. The latest interesting development in the industry is this product here. It's a new soap called Pure and Natural. Does that remind you a little bit of Ivory? In most companies, old brands sort of get left alone to kind of fade away. But that hasn't happened at Ivory. Why not? Why the continual improvement?
Well, Ivory really became a gigantic brand to us very quickly. It was really part of Americana before the end of the 19th century. It was the leading brand, and it wasn't very difficult in those circumstances to realize the importance of keeping it up to date in terms of what consumers wanted. And also to recognize the very particular characteristics it had of purity and mildness, floated, was white. So the fact that it was of such gigantic importance to the company, there were many people in those days that called Procter & Gamble the Ivory Company.
So the whole idea of maturity is sort of a misnomer, isn't it?
Totally misnomer. The idea that there is some product life cycle, which you'll sometimes hear talked about, that you're destined somehow to go up and then start to come down, is totally an issue that's in the control of the people managing the business.
You mentioned earlier that it's the sort of key first step is really being in touch with the consumer and what that consumer really wants at a very personal level. You know, how do you and the other Procter & Gamble executives actually do that? How do you understand the consumer? You just can't kind of think about it. You've got to get more input than that. How do you do it?
You've got to sit down and talk to consumers. And there are a whole variety, and you need to do it in a whole variety of ways. You can get benefit from talking to a group of consumers at one place. And I do that every time we have introduced a major new brand. Since I've been president of this company, and I certainly did it before, I will find an opportunity to get out into the test market. And I want to look at stores, but I also want to sit down in a room with consumers and hear them talk about the brand.
We've talked a lot about the change at Ivory, but you've already hinted at the continuity. Despite over 100 years of history, here's a brand where certain essential elements have been preserved. How do you actually preserve continuity as people change, as time changes? What process do you use to do that?
Well, there's several, as you'd expect. One is simply the continuity of our own management. We promote from within without really any exception. We know each other awfully well. The people who've been responsible for Ivory over the last 30, 35 years are all still in this company. Now, they're not all working on Ivory every day or every week or even every year, but they are here. The point of continuity, too, I would also stress is importantly related to our advertising agencies and our attitude toward our advertising agencies. Our relationships with agencies are ones that are very long-lasting for us. And again, Ivory's a marvelous example of that. We have been working with the same agency on Ivory for 67 years.
John, what does a brand mean at Procter & Gamble?
Well, we think of a brand as, it's almost alive. It may sound corny to say that, but it becomes almost a person. It's first and foremost something that we just see bring benefits to consumers, and that's the way we really view what we're about, is bringing benefits to the consumers. But it assumes a personality, almost a character to it.
Now, as we look over the history of the bar soap category and the history of Ivory, we see a succession of new segments opening up and new competitors coming on the scene, Dial, Dove, other products. Now, by and large, Procter & Gamble, in dealing with those changes, has chosen not to kind of change Ivory, but rather to introduce new brands. Why is that? Why not just create a new model of Ivory? Why introduce a whole new brand?
These have been very difficult, challenging decisions. Each one of those you mentioned. Should we make Ivory a deodorant bar? Should we add cold cream or some other cosmetic ingredient to Ivory? Mm-hmm. Believe me, as I answer this, don't let me leave you with the impression that the answer was obvious or We didn't go back and forth in the thinking process on it. We did, and on each and every one of them. But in each one of them, too, we felt that the right way to proceed was to introduce a different brand to provide that benefit, because we felt that adding deodorants to Ivory or adding a cold cream ingredient to Ivory would really be inconsistent with one of the basic features, qualities, attributes that consumers wanted. And because we felt that the values that Ivory did stand for, as it was, were still of such broad appeal and broad interest to consumers that we would be able to have a healthy, and if we operated it properly, a growing business without having those ingredients. So we felt we ought to leave Ivory in that sense the way it was, that is, not containing these ingredients and not providing those particular benefits, and do them on another brand.
Now, we've seen and heard the Ivory story, a classic story in American industry. What lessons does the Ivory story hold for strategy? Well, I think it holds lessons at two different levels. For strategy in general, as well as how to compete with a low-cost strategy. The soap industry illustrates how a number of companies can successfully compete in the same industry, provided they choose different strategies. Ivory has been successful, Dial has been successful, Dove has been successful. They're all choosing different positions in the marketplace. But Me Too strategies rarely succeed. We've never heard of most of the other soap brands that tried to imitate either Ivory or Dial and Dove. They never made it. The Ivory case also shows us that the successful strategies are ones that are consistently implemented over long periods of time. You can't succeed in strategy if you're flip-flopping what you're trying to be every year. The flip-flopping not only confuses your organization, but it confuses the marketplace. The marketplace doesn't really know what to make of your product or service. Now, the Ivory story, however, vividly illustrates the principle that strategy has to change if the industry structure or competitive positions change enough. The emergence of new buyer needs, the threat of new competitors may force a company, as it did Ivory, to shift its strategy. In Ivory's case, from differentiation to low cost. But shifting a strategy is a very risky and very time-consuming process. And Ivory shows how long it took really to fundamentally reposition the company.